and welcome to the Nation Fridays edition with me, Elaine Noor Abdullah. And as usual, every Friday on The Nation, we'll be discussing trending news and stories within the week together with our selected panel. And today I'm joined by AZHAR, Managing Director of 7W Associates, Nigel Wong, Treasurer for MATTA, DR.OH, of course, Senior Fellow, Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show this Friday. I'm very glad to be joined by such a stellar cast today. I'll begin with stories that have been trending, and I'll touch a little bit on personal data security. So this story, there's been an alarming caution over the country's cyber security viability following, of course, the allegation of the reported sale of personal details of millions of Malaysians. And this alleged website, which contained the data, has since been taken down by the authorities hours after it was discovered on the 12th of June. And the NKN, or National Security Council, via the NACSA, National Cybersecurity Agency, is calling on the government agencies and private organizations to tighten security and protection of personal data owned by them. And of course, the government will not compromise with any entities which threaten national cybersecurity, including public personal data. And the communications minister says cooperation from all parties is crucial in efforts to curb cases of leakage, misuse, or sale of personal data by irresponsible parties. Now I'll go to the panel with regards to your comments on this. EIZAZ, let's have you weigh in on this first. You know, we're talking about cyber security and data. What's your thoughts on this?
So I think in recent weeks, we've seen a lot of leaks of huge databases, right? We've seen them coming from the government. We've seen them coming from agencies. Even, I heard some health data has also been flying around out there, and it's also for sale. So I suppose the first thing is we want to ask, how did these individuals get into this data? But the second part of it is we talk about personal data. And for example, my IC. Every time I go to a condominium and I have to deliver a parcel, literally my IC is there. When I sign up for a gym, when I sign up for something, my IC is there. And sometimes they have access to my license, sometimes they have access to all sorts of different things. Is that covered under personal data protection? I'm sure it is, but has it been put into practice? So the way we treat our own data and our own security is also something to be considered, right? So if we, the users, also don't really understand what we're getting into, then when it starts to be abused or it starts to be leaked and stuff like that, we also kind of turn a blind eye to it to a certain extent. Right? I'm sure like half the country knows my IC and my address by now, actually. On that note, right?
I think you brought up a very salient point. I know our information is out there in every sort of little nook and cranny. So it's very hard for us to be able to say where this data is coming from. Dr. O, let's get your thoughts on this.
Well, I think data privacy, it's really a two-way street. Sometimes we also want some of the merchants to, in a sense, tailor what their provision of services and products to us, right? So that I know I want to eat a certain food, so that I will always be prompted by that sort of food. But in order to do that, they have to know about my habits and so on. So it's a very precarious balance between how much I want to disclose as to my taste versus how I would like them to sort of customize and specialize their services to me. I think even in more advanced countries, we don't have standard answers yet. But in Malaysia, I think indeed the protection of very crucial and basic data, such as our IC numbers and so on, so that there won't be another person who borrow money on my behalf and like a few $1 million of debt for me. Yeah.
So essentially, I think a lot of us are just worried about the implications and impact it can have on our personal lives, whether or not it's financial ruin, whether or not it's sort of impersonation or health issues. Nigel, your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, we've looked at our preferences of giving our data out, and like Dr. O said, sometimes we do want to do it in order to get tailored services to what we want. But I think one other aspect that we may be not focusing too much attention on is the guardianship aspect that comes from the entities that own our data. Now, a lot of us think that when our data is made available on the web, somebody's hacked into a system, exposed the database, and copied everything else. While that may be true to a large extent, there's also the weakest link in any organization, which are the people. Now, if the people working in that organization are not adequately trained, prepared, or not aware of their role in protecting this data, then no matter how secure your systems are, there are also going to be leaks due to the human factor. So maybe that's something the government needs to look into, maybe put harsher penalties, or maybe do intensive training for the agencies that hold and take care of our data.
Yeah, so which comes back to the sort of that combination of the introduction of this story, which was that all parties, all stakeholders need to play their part in order for us to keep each other safe in terms of our personal data and use it responsibly. Now, EIZAZ, I want to go to your topic for this week. Let's start with what's on your mind.
Well, so I suppose there's been a lot of talk about a global recession coming in, right? And I think generally a lot of people are divided among it. Some of them are saying, we really can't see the signs, but to take a look at what I've understood, right? So when during to be the telltale signs are when a lot of capital outflow just starts to disappear from the market. People start to become safe. And I think Dr. O is going to talk about the Fed rate hike, which by the way was the largest in like 40 years. It's like 0.7%, which is extremely high. So the first thing I looked at is the S&P 500, right? It's at its lowest point at this point in time. And then usually what happens is you see investments moving from so-called index funds to more, I would say, safer alternatives like gold and like treasury bonds. But those don't seem to be rising in perpendicular across as well. And of course, the crypto market has like completely gone, right? And are these the telltale signs of a recession? I would say if the Russian war does continues, right? It is a huge contributor to the economy. Europe still relies a lot of it on gas. And if something hits that, right, I think there will be a bit of a spillover effect. We're already beginning to feel it in the price of goods, food coming up here and there. But those are the things that I have been looking at. I wouldn't be a naysayer and say, yes, there's going to be a recession for sure. But there are things that are moving on that I find very, very interesting in that aspect.
I wanted to get Nigel's take before I go to Dr. O. Nigel, perhaps your thoughts on this.
Well, on that note, inflation is on the rise. We've seen increases in everything from goods and services, and unfortunately in Malaysia here, and probably in many other parts of the world, coming out of a pandemic, all our economies are very vulnerable at this point. And in Malaysia, we do have a bit of a disparity as to how much people are earning as to how much the cost of living is like nowadays. And I suppose I'm just a little bit worried that whether or not a global recession will happen, I think that the Malaysian rakyat is beginning to feel some of that effect already, whether or not we've actually gone into recession. And we need to be able to shore ourselves up before the recession genuinely hits.
Right. Dr. O, your take on this. Let's hear what you have to say.
Well, maybe I will jump straight into my topic.
Yeah, so hence, we can link both of them together as well.
Yeah, I think the U.S. Federal Reserve, just like any other central bank, including our Bank Negara, they are trying very hard to balance, on the one hand, this sort of runaway inflation, and on the other hand, the danger indeed of what my fellow speakers have said, namely the possibility of a recession, right? So by so-called hiking the federal funds rate, namely it makes it more expensive, much more expensive for institutions and people to borrow money. Therefore, hopefully, I think what the Fed was trying to do was by raising this rate so that there will be less hot money in the market, and thereby the prices of things would go down. So that is what we say by depressing the inflation. But at the same time that you do that, as you try to, in the Fed's calculation, bring the inflation down to, let's say, around 2% per annum. On the other hand, you're going to create, you're almost going to push for some form of recession. Already in the United States, I think first quarter GDP growth was already negative. if we have another quarter in the US, that is the world's largest economy, then we are indeed looking at the so-called technical recession for the US. And if the US goes into technical recession, the rest of the world very soon would follow suit if we look at history. So I think our central bank is also trying to do this balancing act very carefully. On the one hand, we have our share of heightened inflation. So not our Fed, but our Bank Negara also raised the interest rate a little bit to try to tame the inflation. But on the other hand, you will see your friends who are business owners and so on, they say it's hard to get capital. And with a heightened rate, it will be even more difficult to get capital. If they don't get capital, they cannot expand their business. So economy will also slow down. So it's a very difficult balance between the two. Yeah.
So this is a precarious situation that we're in, and it looks like, it's affecting. It's got a ripple effect. Everybody's going to be linked and affected. EIZAZ, you want to, or Nigel, you want to comment? Any comment on this? Let's start with you, EIZAZ.
Well, to look at how some of the businesses have reacted, not particularly to the Fed hike, but Tesla has begun to cut some of their personnel. I think the
Raise prices
regional manager
too.
in Singapore. Yes, correct. So the regional manager in Singapore, I think, was one of the casualties of this entire thing. Shopee, as I've read recently, has also started to cut down a lot on their staff and everything. I suppose there is something to be anticipated. And because when these businesses do not provide those services anymore, expect to pay a higher price for goods, for ease of life, I suppose, right?
And we have a question from our team. Perhaps we can get some answers with regards to what are the signs for a recession that Malaysians should know about. Perhaps I go back to Dr. Oh. Can you just perhaps highlight so that we have some warning signs or clues?
Well, right now, we still have a growth rate in the region of, I think if I remember correctly, 3, 4, even 5% and so on. But again, I think as hinted just now, we also have a very large gap between the very rich and the very poor, right? Our so-called Gini coefficient is not very low. So while as a whole, for example, due to the boom in oil palm or palm oil prices, due to the boom in oil and gas and so on, it would appear that our economy is really propelling itself ahead. But if you ask our friends who are, for example, small and medium business owners, I see, for example, a lot of these shops are closing down in some of our major malls. And then on the other hand, our friends who are, having their businesses and so on, they are also complaining of, as I said, the lack of capital, and also they could not sell their things, their services. So there's this, disjuncture between the so-called our sort of rosy growth future versus what's really going on the ground.
Nigel, any comments? If not, we'll go on to your topic too.
Well, all I can say is Dr. O is correct, and I can tell you from the tourism perspective, many of which are small, medium businesses, many people can't get assistance from the banks for one reason or another, and a lot of the businesses we see are not only just retrenching and still retrenching or can't even find manpower, a lot of businesses are gradually just closing down.
Nigel, let's talk about your topic for this week.
Okay, I did say I wanted to talk about the bond odori, but not really on what's been happening lately, all the arguments that are going on. What I was most concerned about this bond odori issue was the issue of what is culture. And, in the tourism perspective, we've always been trying to promote Malaysian culture, but culture is a two-way street, like tourism. You need to be able to understand and respect other cultures in order for other cultures to accept and respect yours. And culture is a living, growing thing. We're no longer just a Malay, Chinese, or Indian community. In this modern day and age, we are part of the global stage. And in order for the world to see Malaysia as a truly global player, they need to see Malaysians not just as truly Asians, but truly global. And that means being able to accept and understand the cultures of other peoples and other nations.
Yes. Any comments, Dr. O?
Well, I remember my days as a student in US, right? Well, I'm ethnically Chinese. Of course, I try to eat some Chinese food, but then, you have Americanized Chinese food, which you could not find in other parts of the world. But at first, you could not get used to it. But, nowadays, after coming back for more than 20 years, I'm sort of nostalgic about that. Those sort of what General Cho's chicken, sweet and sour something, and so on. By the same token, in Malaysia as well, our food items, we have various cultural elements in what we eat and so on. So if we could unite our people by having sort of a Malaysianized versions of various ethnic food, we should, I think, also try to do and extend it to, for example, our various tourism offerings, for example, that this country is, well, I hate to use this term, but really a rojak culture, right? So that it's a very vibrant and very colorful, yeah.
But that makes us uniquely Malaysian as well. EIZAZ, your thoughts?
So I think, Dr. O, that you are ethically Sabahan. but on a more serious note, right?
Fine.
I think there's another complexity that's thrown into the mix, which is religious beliefs, right? So I think a lot of the religions in Malaysia have actually had a strong influence on how we shape our culture, how we see the world, right? And where do you separate that part of culture and where do you separate that part of religion, right? I think we're still trying to kind of figure it out. That does make us kind of unique Malaysian, right? We have the Malays, Chinese, Indians, Kadazan Dusun all together, but that's also a very unique problem to Malaysia, right? I don't think that this entire amalgamation of culture, race, religion has been entirely organic. Certain parts of it were actually from design, right? From the way the system was created, and when it's by design artificial, so to say, some elements of it were, you will have some issues that only belong to us, that only we can solve, I believe.
Now, of course, this can be a very long-standing debate. Culture, religion, it's all part and parcel. But I think we just have to find a way for us to. I think when you started out, Nigel, is for us to be able to respect each other's culture in order for us to be able to experience more, open our eyes, welcome, be embracing, be all-encompassing. We learn more when we accept our differences versus trying to create some kind of sameness. The world has become globalized, which creates a lot of replication of the same thing everywhere. Individuality is sort of getting lost in the mix, and I hope that we can maintain that kind of individualistic culture for us to be able to learn from those things instead of trying to eradicate and make everything the same. We're going to all look like robots eventually. So let's create some kind of differentiation and actually enjoy it and respect it. So that's my take on that. But I want to quickly go on to, of course, your second topic, Dr. Oh, this is going to be a topic for conversation. Let's talk about the death penalty. Perhaps you can lay it out for us.
Well, I think our law ministers just informed us that Malaysia has, in a sense, eradicated or abandoned this so-called mandatory death penalty sentencing. Now, what do we mean by mandatory? For example, there are certain offenses, such as even possession of firearms, such as possession of drugs, and so on. Let's say more than 15 grams of heroin that you possess, you have to be sentenced to death. Even if you have a very, the very poor family backgrounds, you are forced into doing this and so on, the judge has no choice but to sentence you to death. Though this so-called the abandonment of mandatory death sentencing does not mean the death sentence is hereby abolished. It simply means the judge would have a choice whether to impose or not impose a death penalty. But for some of us who are more progressively minded, the good news is actually what is unsaid. Namely, this country, Malaysia, I'm actually quite proud to say, I think since about, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago, we actually have a moratorium on carrying out death sentence. Namely, we no longer...
I think we lost Dr. O there, technically. EIZAZ, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I also look at Singapore and how they've treated the death penalty law. It's still very ironically alive and kicking, right? in Singapore, right? But yeah, I suppose it does give a higher jurisdiction of levers to pull for the judges, and I think there are certain things that really shouldn't carry the death penalty, right? Firearms, there are all these things that could actually go past way beyond an imprisonment and stuff like that. So I think that is definitely something to look at, right?
Nigel, your thoughts on the latest announcement?
Well, I think maybe early on, much earlier on, the death penalty was introduced more as a prevention is better than cure kind of mechanism, right? And to a certain extent, when the world was probably simpler, not so complicated, that may have worked to a certain extent. But there's also another problem with any sort of law. When it becomes too strict and it becomes too technical, there is no room for error, there is no room for flexibility. And like Dr. O said earlier on, being sentenced to death for carrying just a firearm and not using it, for example, or having minuscule amounts of drugs, on your person, that may not be fair. I mean, personally, I prefer rehabilitation rather than the death penalty. And so I think in terms of Malaysia, kudos, I think it's a step in the right direction.
Dr. O, you want to be able to continue? I think we had the
Oh, yeah, sorry.
you there.
No, I was just saying I feel rather glad that Malaysia has imposed a de facto moratorium on execution. Namely, we don't execute people anymore. And this was across several administrations. I think from the Najib through the Mahathir and Muhyiddin and now Ismail Sabri administrations. So hopefully this trend could continue, and we would one day, well, in my humble opinion, abolish the death penalty here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's definitely a start that mandatory death sentencing has now been officially removed. And as you mentioned earlier, Dr. O, it doesn't mean that the death sentence or death penalty no longer is applicable. It's just now given the judges now give the choice to impose the appropriate punishment to the appropriate sort of crimes that have been committed, as opposed to, like you mentioned earlier, having no choice but a mandatory death sentence associated with, I think there were 11 offenses that carried the mandatory death sentence. But I want to be able, before we close, cover a few more topics. I wanted to highlight some of the topics that we wanted to talk about was, of course, the labor shortage, which has been sort of affecting everyone greatly. So I just want to highlight a little bit of introduction. Recently, of course, the Malaysian Estate Owners Association says Malaysia is missing this golden opportunity to capitalize on high palm oil prices and could suffer more production losses due to severe shortages. And it's just not just the palm oil industry that's been suffering with this. As you mentioned earlier, Nigel, even the hospitality industry that's trying to bounce back is also facing difficulty, manpower shortages there as well. And I think there are a lot of industries that are trying to climb back out of the economic fallout and trying to get workers. But there has been quite a lot of difficulty despite the lifting of the COVID-19 freeze on recruiting foreign workers. Back in February, Malaysia has not seen a significant return of migrant workers because of slower approvals, protracted negotiations with the countries that they are looking to hire these foreign workers, and of course over worker protection. So perhaps I'll start with Nigel on this topic. Perhaps you can comment on this as it affects the hospitality industry that has been facing the same problems as well.
Well, I think, Elaine, you basically summed it up, and the hospitality industry is at the moment very heavily reliant on foreign workers. Our local people don't actually want to work in hotels simply because of the conditions hospitality workers are exposed to. But that being said, a funny story here. A while back, just before the pandemic hit, I was speaking to a Nepalese security guard in one of the properties that I stay in, and he actually said he was going back, and I asked him why, and he said, well, Malaysia doesn't pay so well anymore because of the currency conversion rates. So I think this is going to be more than just a temporary issue where we can't find foreign labor to come in. If our economy also doesn't improve, we may find that Malaysia is not as attractive to foreign labor as it previously was.
Yeah, so this is a multi sort of pronged problem. It's no longer just a migrant and sort of like the red tape issues, but it was also, the benefits of actually coming to Malaysia versus, other more lucrative countries. EIZAZ, you want to comment on this?
So I think we look at what we call dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs, right? These 3Ds, these are 3D kind of jobs. If I worked as a janitor, right, how would I go back and explain this to my parents? Oh, I work as a janitor. I'm so embarrassed. But that actually shouldn't be the way. It's the same way that our people we see if someone went to vocational school, right? If I went to vocational school, for example, oh man, he just maybe didn't lulus SPM, he couldn't get past his exams, therefore he's in vocational
Blue
school.
collar, right?
Yeah, but if I were to go to vocational school in Germany, I could be an AMG engineer. So I think it's that perception of mindset. It's going to take some time because all this while we've outsourced it to very, very cheap labor, right? And now all of a sudden that thing that has disappeared, that pool has disappeared, and we're saying, hey, can we do this ourselves? And I think it's going to take some time, but the same way like how COVID pretty much revolutionized everything and everything is done online, maybe we could see a shift to the higher income services sector or more professionalization of certain jobs. I think that would be a jump start in the right direction, actually.
It's high time that we start, supporting our own economy instead of being reliant on external sort of assistance and help and workforce. Dr. Oh, your thoughts on this before we close today?
Well, number one, my friends in construction industry has been telling me the same thing, namely his workers are getting paid higher in Indonesia, so they don't want to come back anymore. Number two, as we sometimes go to Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on, and we look at how they build their buildings, they use exclusively local workers, right? I mean, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Australians building their own buildings. Very strangely, frankly speaking, we are just a developing country, much poorer than these developed countries, and yet we are not using our own workers. So I think that's something we really have to think about here.
Thank you so much, Dr. O, for your thoughts on that. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. Revolution is the key. It's not going back to the same way of how we've been doing things. As I think you pointed out that the COVID-19 pandemic helped us to be able to, find new opportunities, new solutions, and new ways of doing things. And Nigel, hopefully the hospitality industry will be revamping its services sector in order for us to be able to, perhaps it's no longer all just, manpower. There are new services or new AI and technology that's going to be able to allow us to work more efficiently and more productive. And that's all the time that I have. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me. We were speaking to AZHAR, Managing Director, 7W Associates, Nigel Wong, Treasurer MATTA, and Dr. O. Senior Fellow for Singapore Institute of International Affairs on The Nation this week. And that wraps up this episode. Continue to stay safe and practice SOPs to keep each other safe. I'm Elaine Nobla. Bye for now.